Joseph Joachim's Overture Heinrich IV, Opus 7 from 1855, may work as an overture to the play Henry IV by William Shakespeare, but it was written to stand on its own in the concert hall. In the 19th century, many overtures were written to introduce a specific performance of the original opera or play. The same can be said about the Hamlet Overture from 1858 by Franz Liszt, and most of Beethoven's overtures. However, Beethoven's overtures were among the first to be considered so important or good. They were separated from the performance of the play or the opera they were originally written to precede. And in the end, the concert overture, being inspired by a play but not preceding it, thanks to the reception of Beethoven, became a genre all of its own. Some of these overtures, like the Hamlet Overture by Franz Liszt, became or were called symphonic poems at a later point in history. A clear distinction between concert overture and symphonic poem cannot always be made. Typically, a concert overture will follow classical sonata form, while the symphonic poem does not necessarily need to. Felix Mendelssohn Bartholdy and the Swiss composer Joachim Raff both wrote overtures for concert halls. Joseph Joachim wrote 2 Shakespeare overtures, Hamlet, Opus 4, after Shakespeare's Hamlet, and Heinrich IV, Opus 7, after Shakespeare's Henry IV. It wasn't performed very often, but it had a famous admirer, Joseph Joachim's friend Johannes Brahms. Brahms even published an arrangement of it for 2 piano players. There are 3 recordings of Joseph Joachim's Opus 7. The first was done in 1989 with the London Philharmonic Orchestra conducted by Leon Botstein. The second was done in the year 2000 with the Oslo Philharmonic Orchestra, conducted by Maris Jansons. It is my personal favorite. Both are already out of print and can only be bought second-hand. The third recording from 2012 is the piano version by Johannes Brahms, played by Silke-Thora and Christian Köhn. It is still for sale today. Johannes Brahms had met Joseph Joachim in about that time when Joachim was writing his overture. In 1852, Johannes Brahms was doing his first and last concert tour through the northern kingdoms and princedoms of Germany. He was 19 years old. Joseph Joachim was only 2 years older, but he was already in charge of all concert performances in the then still very new Royal Opera House of Hanover. Hanover is also where the kings of England came from, but their common line of kings had been separated in 1836 when Queen Victoria ascended the throne of the United Kingdom and Duke Ernst August became King of Hanover. His heir King George V of Hanover, who ascended the throne in 1851, was blind and very interested in music. The new Royal Opera House had 3 different sectors of the performing arts. Theatre and opera were performed on the big stage, and a smaller hall in the northern wing of the building was used for concert performances. This was the part Joseph Joachim was in charge of. He let the European musical elite perform here, including Clara Schumann, Franz Liszt and Hector Berlioz, and Johannes Brahms and Joseph Joachim, who by then had become fast friends, would search together for the most suitable accommodations of Joseph Joachim's illustrious star guests. Joseph Joachim introduced Johannes Brahms to Robert Schumann. Joseph Joachim even helped introduce Wagner's Tannhäuser to Hanover. The opera house was still formally led by the old and weary Heinrich Marschner, who had already exceeded his 15 years of fame, and the lead actor of the theatre division was in fact Karl Devrients, the nephew of Ludwig Devrients, the famous Shakespeare actor in Berlin and best friend of E.T.A. Hoffmann. Johannes Brahms took lodgings in a former brothel in Hanover at the Papenstieg, just outside of the city wall, to prepare the publication of his first pieces of music. Unfortunately, the brothel had been built tastefully with mouldings of Venuses and lotus flowers, but not for eternity. When Brahms moved in, the pimps were long gone, but the building itself was already decrepit. There was a cultural heritage plate attached to it before the First World War, but after the World War there wasn't anything left to restore. But it was probably here where Johannes Brahms also prepared his piano version of the most successful Joseph Joachim Overture, Heinrich IV. But what is it about? No overture adapts the play scene by scene as it is written. Rather, the composer will choose particular scenes or characters which set in motion their musical ingenuity. Sometimes it's a specific actor's performance. Liszt's Hamlet overture, for example, was inspired by the performance of the actor Bogumil Davison. Shakespeare's play Henry IV was introduced to German theatres by Berlin's most famous Shakespeare actor and personal friend of E.T.A. Hoffmann, Ludwig Devrients. He was an ardent admirer of all Shakespeare plays. Of all historical plays, Henry IV was his favourite, and he himself played the part of Sir John Falstaff. In Orson Welles' famous movie adaptation Chimes at Midnight, Falstaff is the main character. The same can be said about Edward Elgar's symphonic poem Falstaff. And when Ludwig Devrients played him, you can bet he was in the center of the action whenever he was present. After his death, however, Falstaff became considerably less central to German performances of the play Henry IV. Why was that? Particularly in the second part of the play, it is made very clear that Falstaff's residence, the Boar's Head, isn't just a tavern or pub. It is a brothel. In 19th century Germany, particularly in the second half, showing a brothel with whores and pimps was considered improper, to put it mildly. Therefore, the Falstaff scenes, particularly in the second part of the play, were cut either severely or entirely. Devrients' brother, who had sponsored Ludwig's career, had 3 sons, who all became actors. Karl Devrients became the lead actor of the Royal Theatre of Hanover, as I already told you. Eduard Devrients was originally a librettist and singer, but he had ruined his baritone voice by performing the part of the Knight Templar Bois-Guilbert in Heinrich Marschner's opera adaptation of Walter Scott's Ivanhoe, Der Templer und die Jüdin. After that, he became a character actor and stage director in Karlsruhe. His stage adaptation of Shakespeare's Henry IV was printed, published, and performed in several German princedoms and dukedoms. It is representative for German performances of the play in the second half of the century, in that it has cut considerably both the brothel scenes and the part of Falstaff. They are still there, just not as important. So it may no longer surprise you that in Joseph Joachim's overture the character of Falstaff is in fact not represented by a musical theme of his own. He is still present, but only between the lines. Now, if the overture in fact is not about Falstaff, like Edward Elgar's symphonic poem would be, who then is it about? I would like to ask you a different question. Knowing that Karl Devrients was by no means the best actor among Ludwig's nephews, but by sure the most handsome, the most popular, and the most successful, which part would you think he was required to play? Because it was not King Henry IV. It was not the young Prince Hal either. He played Falstaff when he had the age for it, but not before, and it was probably more because he felt that his famous Uncle Ludwig's legacy kind of demanded him to. His most eminent performance was that of Percy Hotspur. Now, Percy Hotspur appears in Orson Welles' Chimes at Midnight too, but he is ridiculed throughout the movie. We even see his naked ass. And in Fritz Kortner's stage adaptation of the play, in which Prince Hal was played by the still very young Klaus Kinski, Percy Hotspur is further ridiculed by giving him a stutter to ruin his otherwise fairly eloquent, if somewhat excited dialogue. Note that this was after the World Wars. It seems that after the World Wars, Percy Hotspur was no longer considered a worthy opponent for the young Prince Hal, who becomes King Henry V at the end of the play. But before the World War, this was completely different. His type of military character was very much in demand, particularly in Germany, but not only in Germany. The Sherlock Holmes character Jack Sparks in Mark Frost's 1993 novel The List of Seven even considers Percy Hotspur to be his most eminent performance as a stage actor. He wouldn't say that if the character was not to be considered important. In the 19th century, Percy Hotspur was the classical heavy, the character providing the most conflict in the story. When writing about his overture, Joachim mentioned only Percy Hotspur and the prince repeatedly. Obviously, their conflict piqued Joachim's interest the most, and this is why in Joseph Joachim's overture, Percy Hotspur is featured as its main antagonist. Besides both being prone to tantrums, Joachim even might have felt a personal kinship with the character of Hotspur, because the main protagonist or anti-hero of his earlier concert overture, Demetrios, Opus 6, shares a very similar predicament. Joseph Joachim's Demetrios is based on the play Demetrios, written by his friend Hermann Grimm, the son of Wilhelm Grimm, most famous for his fairy tale anthologies. It describes the false Tsarevich Dimitri's fall from power due to his bloodline, or rather the lack thereof, because in fact he wasn't the real Tsarevich. Compared to the Demetrios fragment of Friedrich Schiller, the Demetrios play by Friedrich Hebbel, or the Boris Godunov play by Pushkin, which was turned into an opera by Modest Mussorgsky, Hermann Grimm's version is both the most unhistorical and the most joyless to read. It is puzzling whatever Joseph Joachim saw in it, were it not for its main character, the false Demetrius. Hermann Grimm introduces him as an inspirational military and political leader. He isn't the real Tsarevich, yet by merit alone he probably should be. But in the end he can save his soul only by relinquishing his power, because in Hermann Grimm's play the royal bloodline trumps merit. There is a certain similarity to the character of Percy Hotspur. King Henry IV says himself he wishes Percy was his son instead of the actual Prince Hal, the Prince of Wales, because by military experience and merit alone he probably should be, were it not for his lack of the royal bloodline. Why was Joseph Joachim drawn to these kind of characters who are, by their bloodline, prevented from reaching their full potential? Joseph Joachim was the descendant of a Jewish family. In the service of King George V, he converted to being a Lutheran Christian, but he was very aware of the anti-Semitic prejudices in his time and uncompromising when demanding equal pay for the unconverted Jewish members of his orchestra. Before Johannes Brahms came along, Joseph Joachim, Hermann Grimm and Sabine von Arnim used to be virtually inseparable. But when Sabine von Arnim decided to marry Hermann Grimm and not Joachim, their friendship quickly fell apart. Knowing how anti-Semitic her father Achim von Arnim was, and this fact is beyond dispute, it was very likely for Joseph Joachim to assume that his bloodline, as perceived by anti-Semitic prejudice, had played at least some part in her decision. Note that it can neither be rectified nor falsified if Joseph Joachim actually felt a kinship with Percy Hotspur or the false Demetrius based on on their perceived bloodline preventing them from reaching their full potential. It is just very likely, that's all. In Joseph Joachim's overture, about half of the piece is about Percy Hotspur. He may be its actual anti-hero, sharing and foreshadowing characteristics and character development with Richard Strauss's anti-hero from his symphonic poem Don Juan. By the way, Strauss might have heard Joachim's overture as it was, just like Don Juan, performed and conducted by Hans von Bülow. However, his Don Juan was already finished by then. Both anti-heroes, however, share the fate of, despite being the superior swordsmen, having their legacy cut short by losing to a considerably weaker opponent, who has neither experience nor skill, only God on his side. Joseph Joachim's overture follows classical sonata form with some special particularities. The first theme complex is almost entirely about Percy Hotspur, who is presented as heroic and dashing, but also quick-tempered and irascible. It goes back and forth between him and the court of King Henry IV, trying to calm him down. Perhaps you still remember the first scene of the play. Percy Hotspur had helped Henry Bolingbroke to defeat the rightful King Richard II and crown himself King Henry IV. Now King Henry IV refuses to pay ransom for Percy's cousin Mortimer, who has been arrested by the Welsh-famed sorcerer Owen Glendower. In the end, Percy, persuaded by his uncle Worcester, decides Mortimer, who also happens to be the designated heir of the late King Richard II, might be the better king after all, and starts to openly rebel. The second theme complex introduces two very different characters. The serious King Henry IV, having a bad conscience and being worried not only about Percy's rebellion, but also about his son and heir, the young Prince Hal. And this here is probably Prince Hal himself, preferring to drink and to rob in the company of the fat old Sir John Falstaff and his thieving friends and servants over fighting his father's wars. But in the closing group, the Schlussgruppe, father and son finally come together, and King Henry confronts Prince Hal about his failure to be worthy of the throne that awaits him. Now Prince Hal swears he will prove his worth by defeating his rival Percy Hotspur. Now, we have had the first theme complex about Percy Hotspur, the second theme complex about the royal family, and the closing group finishing the so-called exposition of the usual three-part sonata form. Now there should come the second part, the so-called development or Durchführung, just that there is no Durchführung, there is no development part. Joseph Joachim leaves it out, and the so-called recapitulation or reprise begins instead. This is strange and unusual, but Joseph Joachim's Hamlet overture is structured exactly in the same way. No development, neither in Hamlet nor in his Henry IV. However, you could say that musically, the recapitulation also serves as development because it is so strongly varied. We meet Percy Hotspur again at the field of Shrewsbury shortly before the battle between the rebels against Prince and King begins. But this time, the instrumentation of the themes of Percy Hotspur and his first theme complex is a lot lighter and softer and altogether lacking the assuredness and energy of the exposition. Probably because Percy's ally, the famed sorcerer Glendower, has preferred to not appear, leaving their forces a lot weaker than anticipated. But the battle is already underway. And then the unexpected happens. The superior and more experienced swordsman, Percy Hotspur, is mortally wounded by Prince Hal. Joseph Joachim marks the death of Percy by inserting a slow section based on Percy Hotspur's initial motive, which brings the recapitulation to a temporary standstill. Even the music I personally found extremely reminiscent of the ending of the symphonic poem Don Juan, which Richard Strauss would compose 40 years later. Don Juan is, like Percy Hotspur, introduced as a character of a certain similarly, say, effervescent virility, only to be killed off in the end, dueling with an inferior swordsman. Only after Percy Hotspur's death, Joseph Joachim finally continues his recapitulation of the second theme complex. But in this variation, the themes of King Henry IV and his son, Prince Hal, are joined together as a coronation march. Obviously, it is meant to represent the coronation of Prince Hal. King Henry IV has died, and now the former Prince Hal is going to be coronated King Henry V. In Shakespeare's play, King Henry V's coronation march is disturbed by his former friend, the witty, fat, and selfish Sir John Falstaff, who was already counting on a place in King Henry's court. Instead, King Henry delays his coronation to banish his former friend over 50 miles away. In Joseph Joachim's version, the march is not interrupted, but just before the coda there is an audible delay which might be interpreted as a moment of hesitation on the former Prince Hal's side, until the young King Henry V just continues with his coronation, passing Falstaff by, ignoring and leaving him as a broken man. Joseph Joachim repeated this very scene in his real life, with his former friend Johannes Brahms playing the part of the passed-by and ignored Sir John Falstaff. How did that happen? Joseph Joachim and Johannes Brahms were the best of friends. Brahms became the famous composer. Joachim gave up composition and became the famous violinist, conductor, and principal of the University of Performing Arts in Berlin. How did their friendship collapse? Johannes Brahms never married, but Joseph Joachim was married to the successful mezzo-soprano Amalie Schneeweiss. After the marriage, it was expected from a female singer to abandon the stage. Amalie did abandon the stage of opera, but she did not stop to sing in public, and she also published several songbooks with the publisher Fritz Simrock. And Joseph Joachim, without any proof at all, became convinced they had committed adultery. In 19th century Germany, it was impossible to get an amicable divorce. It could only be done if one of the partners could be proven guilty of some sort of misconduct. So Joseph Joachim had his mind set to prove his wife Amalie was the guilty part. And when Johannes Brahms, in an ill-advised and desperate effort to save their marriage, testified on behalf of Joseph Joachim's wife, that was the end of a wonderful friendship. However, Joseph Joachim never stopped to perform Brahms's music. And once he had given a public performance of Brahms's music, Brahms may have thought it was time to mend their relationship and approached his former friend kind of hopefully, like Sir John Falstaff would, in the line of the other congratulants. And Joseph Joachim, much like Prince Hal in his musical version of the Coronation March, ignored the extended hand and smile and passed him by. They came closer to each other in the following years, but their former friendship was never fully repaired.